So good morning, everyone. I'm John Brisges, the CIO of Exponential. Just to give you a bit of context, Exponential is a service provider with about 3,000 customers that operates pretty much across all verticals, including defense and national security. So it gives you some context of where I'm coming from in the conversation. Now, obviously I look very young, but I have been working in technology for 27 years now. And of that 27 years, 20 years of that have been in service providers. So when you work in a service provider, the beauty you get is you see thousands and thousands of customers. You see different organizations, different problems, different challenges, which is really useful, especially when you operate in this cyber world, this landscape with the emergence of AI. And what's really scary for me is how much we are seeing the impact of cyber attacks on organizations. And whilst the good news is it looks like the ransomware kind of dropped off a little bit last year from the year before, we're still seeing many organizations hit by those challenges. When you really think of this in the context of it, obviously the emergence of AI, and it was brilliant, this sort of set me up in this conversation, Sarah did, is the new shadow IT in relation to AI and generative AI in particular, LLMs, is something we're seeing as a big challenge for organizations when you're looking at that. When you then map that to the geopolitical landscape and what's happening, when we look at this advanced persistent threats that we're seeing more and more of this. And I guess it depends what articles you read and who you believe in what you look at. But state-based actors are often stated to be this. And when you look at your insurance then as an organization, which doesn't necessarily get considered as much, what we're seeing more and more is the insurance companies have lots of ways out in relation to helping and paying for some of these impacts. So your protections, your systems, your services are critical for that. We've seen supply chain vulnerabilities that come in this, but now obviously we're seeing more and more of the AI technology as it advances every week. I mean, who would have thought 2.5 years ago we would have seen it advance as fast as it had? I mean, one of my friends is one of the world-renowned speakers in AI, and he's been talking about this stuff for a long time, but the advancements in the last 2 years versus the 20 years before are incredible in relation to those advancements that have happened in that space. And as you start to see this, it gets scary, especially when, from our studies and we've seen, the activity inside the customers when they're already in is often hundreds of days of pre-activity within that space. So when we look at this, there's a lot of specialists in this room with a lot of deep experience in the cyber world. But when we're looking at this, AI is now becoming more and more active in the technologies we use, but also the perimeter, that threat landscape that sits in there. AI is now a new perimeter vector for us to look after. And when you start to look at that, shadow IT years ago, I actually built one of the first cloud businesses back in 2007 in the UK. It's a long, long time ago when we started to build cloud infrastructure business. And I think there's someone from Fujitsu here who was part of that, the company was part of that at that time. But a long time ago when we were building these things, we used to talk about security as the big challenge for it. Security comes up and down as the priority on it, sometimes drips off, but it's always there as a key factor. But as we get into that, the technologies, and I'm sure you're going to hear from some great speakers in the technology space today as well, who have products that address these areas, these technologies that sit in here are going to help massively in relation to the identification and threat management activities that sit around that. But when it comes to the incident response and you get more towards the far end, generative AI really can become a key technology player that sits within that. So when we're really looking at this, one of the things that I'm doing a lot of work on at the moment is organizations are coming to us as a service provider, in particular in the secure space, or in particular verticals, for example, accountancy, legal, for example, and looking at the way that they implement LLM technologies. And when you think of it, the perimeter and the challenges that are introduced by this, you can't just, switch something on like Copilot and go off we go. You've got to start thinking about all the security and the data vectors that sit with that. So we start off with ethical boundaries, and there's a lot of data that's going to come up on here, so I won't go through every part of it. But when you think of the ethical considerations, it's very much going to be dependent on your organization, what you're able to do, what you want to do, what you're allowing people to do. The gentleman I talked about a couple of minutes ago, he lets everything be open. They know how much everyone's salary is, their bonuses are, they're this modern tech company, they would say. I'm not sure my organisation will be as open to doing that as perhaps others. We then need to think about how we, as we process that data and integrate that data, what can we do to protect that information? How can we put controls around it? Because if you want to use data more effectively, you're integrating multi-source, right? You know, if you're a law firm and you switch Copilot on, great, but it's not necessarily going to be integrated into your practice management system, or it's not going to be integrated into your document management system if that sits in a SaaS play. So, you know, how are you going to do that data integration? How are you going to bring those through? We talk about adversarial attacks, so that, again, was mentioned by Sarah, is, you know, like how long are they in those environments? How are they protecting the data? What information's been given around that? And how are the access controls put in place to do that? I think I was chatting to one of my security team the other day, and, you know, their interpretation of the latest ISO 27001 is that everyone will have to have a PAM, privileged access management, in place within their organisation. That's quite an interesting view if you look at it, because those security controls, access controls around people are the things that, again, you know, are key considerations that we have within there. And as we move forward into that, the authentication methods between the systems and how we manage incident breach and control, these are all just within the LLM space considerations that we have to have. So, you want me to go back? Of course. How about that? So when we start thinking about LLMs within our security strategy, you know, again, you know, everyone's using it, just to be clear. Like, I mean, I use it, everybody uses it, you know, every day. But I mean, I always do this quick question. So how many people in the room use LLMs at least once a week? Okay. How many people have been in a situation where you spent perhaps more time anomalizing the data that you put into the LLM than it perhaps would have taken you to actually write the thing in the first place? Oh, not many, that's good. Or is it? The consideration there is what data is actually going into there. You know, is it controlled, is it not? What are you controlling around that? So obviously with the public LLM, it's there. So in relation to accessibility, it's there, it's available, but the challenges around that, you know, how do your subscription fees come if you want to use it? I mean, if you use ChatGPT and you do 2 pictures, you're out of your credits for the day, right? So you're gonna have to start paying for these things, right? And also, if you look at the pitch quality that comes back, it's not great. But then when we start to look at other options, you know, some organizations will already have SaaS tools in place, so they'll be using it. And obviously, every person providing SaaS is now having to integrate an AI element on it. If you've got a contact center, they're integrating an AI element in it. If you've got a document management system, they're going to be integrating in that. But obviously, that's limited to that silo. And similarly, you could look at AI-specific SaaS. I was talking to someone the other day who was assessing one. I won't say what the technology was, and they were saying, oh, it's contained and controlled, but actually it was integrated into the public at the back end. So actually your data wasn't as secure as you thought it was if you look at the fine print that sits around it. The other option is you could start to build your own, right? So you could build a private solution. You could do that in the public cloud or the private architecture. But as you start to do this, you need to think about, I start to have to read up, how do you manage tokens? How do you controls? How do you scale it? How you do it? Or the other option is you could partner for a secure LLM. And what we're finding with many organizations is that their approach to data security and large language models and AI is we need to control our data. We want to manage the perimeter. And as security professionals as well, part of our guidance has to be, are we happy to have this proliferation of data into multiple technologies, or do we want to do it? When you start to consider that, here's some principles or some thought processes that sit around how that looks and what it could do. When you start at the beginning of this, you know, we need to remember all this part. Our security, our CSOC integration, network integration, controls, etc. You're then going to have your computation layer. This is in the private context, right? Your inference nodes are what you're going to do, your transactional piece, your GPU nodes, the big ones are going to be the learning. But your learning in this world isn't constant, right? As in, when you bring your data in at the first point, there's a lot of learning that needs to be done. After that, it's kind of less complex. So you need to consider how you put that together. The second layer in the common components layer is you need to think about what you're going to use for your LLM. So, you know, you're going to use a GPT, you're going to use a Llama. There's lots of options out there. And I guess depending on the industry, you'll find different people have done a lot of research, investment, and development in that area. The most important part then is your brain structure that sits around that. And obviously, your brains are what are going to control what happens within the environment. So from that perspective, you start off with your councillor responsibility. This is really how you can set your organisational governance and security controls, access, who can do what. Once you've got that in place, that really starts to set the ethical boundaries in your organisation around what you want to do. Once you've layered in that, this is where you can start layering on top of that the different brains that will be needed. So the first one that you're going to need for that is your industry tailoring. If you're in legal, you need to understand a certain lexicon in how it talks, how it responds, what it needs to do. Regulatory compliance can then be brought into it. So if you're in America and you're doing it, you might bring HIPAA in if you're, for healthcare, for example, whatever it may be. But then you can also think about your customized data sets. What do you want to integrate it to? What do you want it to work with? What are the different models? This is where it's critical for the security professionals to help provide that governance and control around that, because you have such a wide spectrum then of data sources. One of the reasons I think private LLMs are quite beneficial is they don't have to be connected to the internet. So if you want to control the data within your organization, you can do so. Secondly, if you want to have access out to things in a mesh architecture, but bring the data in, but don't let it back out, you can control that more effectively than a public platform, which may not be in your control. And then once you've got this, you can then wrap around the wider pieces of it around customization. And depending on your organization's experience and data science capability, this is where there are organizations that can help. I think the big thing with all of this is we always talk about trying to bring this tiering structure together so that you can have an engagement that you can map to a budget. The biggest challenge with data science projects is they'll come in and go, if you could do anything, what would you do? And they go, oh, this is what we'd like to do. Fantastic, right, let's start a T&M engagement. And then suddenly it's very expensive, so you can look at that. But really building out these components and these services helps you to tailor that for your organization. So it's a consideration for you. Do you do private? Do you do public? How do you want to do it? But the security posture that sits around that is critical, and then the service wrap that sits in that. Thinking about that as we move forward then, the key piece for us is how do we then leverage these technologies more effectively in the cyber world? We've talked around integration of technology, platforms and services and data within that. As we advance now, the key thing is how can we use these tools that are out there to more effectively control the state that we're in, whether that be, as I mentioned before, in the predictive side of things, and maybe prescriptive analytics at the front end to actually think about what's going to happen in the future and how can we make decisions based on that, and also in the Gen AI side, which is how can we use generative AI to look and ask queries of those things. So in summary, I think the critical thing in your strategy now is how do you ensure that you can integrate effectively this shadow IT, bring it in-house, wrap your security boundaries around it, and also the big challenge for many organizations is keeping and retaining people. So you don't have to do this all in-house. There are people out there, partners, who can help you with this and support that for you. Now, my time's up. If you have any questions, we have a stand here, stand 5. Please, after, come and see us and have a chat. Thank you very much.